When the police finally broke down the door of 1428 Ashwood Lane, they found everything exactly as the neighbors had described. Furniture overturned, strange symbols scratched into the hardwood floors, windows covered with newspaper and duct tape, and in the center of the living room, a circle drawn in what appeared to be salt, with candles melted down to stumps surrounding it. But there was one thing missing. The man who'd been living there, desperately calling everyone he knew to tell them his house was haunted. Marcus Webb had vanished without a trace. Marcus had moved into the old Victorian house in September of 2019, and by all accounts he'd been thrilled about it. The house was a steal, priced well below market value in the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Sure, it needed some work. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged a bit, and the previous owner had let the yard grow wild. But Marcus saw potential. He was a 34-year-old freelance graphic designer who'd recently gone through a divorce and wanted a fresh start. The house represented independence, a project he could pour himself into, a new chapter in his life. His friends helped him move in on a warm Saturday in early September. They later told investigators that Marcus had been in great spirits that day, joking and laughing, talking about his renovation plans. He wanted to restore the original woodwork, update the kitchen, and turn the attic into a home office. The house had been built in 1887, and despite years of neglect, it still had beautiful bones. Crown molding, original hardwood floors, and a stunning staircase with an ornate banister. Marcus posted photos on social media that first week, proud of his new home, excited about the possibilities. The first sign that something was wrong came about 3 weeks after he'd moved in. Marcus called his best friend, Derek Patterson, around 11 at night. "This is going to sound crazy," Marcus had said, his voice tense, "but I keep hearing footsteps upstairs, like someone's walking around up there. But I'm alone in the house." Derek had laughed it off, suggesting the old house was just settling, or maybe there were raccoons in the attic. Old houses made all kinds of noises. That's just what happened with a place that was over 100 years old. Marcus had agreed, seeming embarrassed that he'd even called. "Yeah, you're probably right," he'd said. "I'm just not used to living alone yet. Sorry for bothering you." But the calls didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, Marcus reached out to various friends and family members with increasing frequency, and his concerns were escalating. He told his sister that he'd wake up in the middle of the night to find all the kitchen cabinets standing open, even though he was certain he'd closed them before bed. He told a co-worker that the temperature in certain rooms would drop suddenly and dramatically, his breath visible in the air even though the heat was on. He mentioned to his mother that he'd sometimes smell something awful, like rotting meat, but could never find the source. His friends started to worry, not about ghosts, but about Marcus's mental state. The divorce had been difficult. He'd been under a lot of stress, moving into a big old house alone, taking on a huge renovation project, dealing with the isolation of working from home. Maybe it was all getting to him. Maybe he was experiencing anxiety or depression manifesting as paranoia. When they suggested he talk to a therapist, Marcus became defensive. "I'm not making this up," he'd insist. "Something is seriously wrong with this house." By November, Marcus's social media posts had changed dramatically. Gone were the cheerful renovation updates and photos of progress. Instead, he posted long, rambling messages about the house's history. He'd been researching obsessively, spending hours at the local library and historical society. He discovered that the house had been built by a man named Edmund Hartley, a wealthy businessman who'd lived there with his wife and 3 children. In 1889, just 2 years after the house was completed, tragedy struck. The wife and 2 of the children died during a diphtheria outbreak. Edmund and his surviving son had continued living in the house for another decade before both mysteriously disappeared. Their bodies were never found. Marcus became convinced that the house was connected to these deaths, that something dark had happened there. He posted photos of old newspaper clippings he'd found, articles about the Hartley family's misfortunes. He shared images of strange stains he'd discovered under the wallpaper in one of the bedrooms. He talked about dreams he was having, vivid nightmares where he saw a woman in old-fashioned clothing standing at the foot of his bed, watching him. His friends were genuinely concerned now. They'd visit the house, but Marcus had become increasingly isolated and paranoid. He'd installed multiple locks on all the doors. He'd covered many of the windows with newspaper, claiming he didn't like the feeling of being watched from outside. The house, which had seemed charming if neglected when he'd first moved in, now felt oppressive and dark. The renovation projects had been abandoned. Boxes remained unpacked. The place had taken on an eerie, neglected atmosphere. Derek Patterson visited in late November and was shocked by what he found. Marcus had lost weight. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping. The house was in chaos, with Marcus's paranormal research spread across every surface. Books about hauntings, printouts about electromagnetic fields and spirit activity, drawings of symbols that Marcus claimed he'd seen in his dreams. He kept telling me that something was trying to communicate with him, Derek later told police. He said he'd been hearing whispers, seeing shadows move in his peripheral vision. He was convinced that whatever was in the house wanted something from him. Derek had tried to convince Marcus to leave, to stay with him for a while, to get some distance from the house. Marcus had refused. "I can't just abandon this," he'd said. "I need to understand what's happening. I need to figure out what it wants." Derek left that day feeling deeply unsettled, not by the house itself, but by how dramatically his friend had changed. The Marcus he'd known, rational and level-headed, seemed to have been replaced by someone paranoid and obsessed. The last confirmed sighting of Marcus Webb was on December 3, 2019. A neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Hastings, saw him carrying bags into the house around 6 in the evening. She noticed he'd purchased candles, lots of them, from the grocery store. She thought it was odd but didn't dwell on it. That same evening, several neighbors reported seeing lights flickering in Marcus's house at unusual hours. One neighbor mentioned hearing what sounded like chanting, though they couldn't be sure if it was coming from Marcus's property or from a television somewhere. The next morning, Marcus's sister, Amy Webb, received a disturbing text message. It was sent at 3:47 a.m., and it simply read, "I'm going to try to make contact tonight. If something happens to me, it's not what it looks like. The house has answers. I need to find them." Amy, who lived 3 hours away, immediately tried calling Marcus. No answer. She called repeatedly throughout the day. Nothing. By evening, she was panicked and called the police to request a wellness check. Officers arrived at 1428 Ashwood Lane around 8 p.m. on December 4th. The house was dark. No one answered their knocks. They could see through a gap in the newspaper-covered windows that something was wrong inside. Furniture appeared to be overturned. After multiple attempts to make contact and growing concerns for Marcus's safety, they obtained permission to force entry. What they found inside defied easy explanation. The living room looked like the scene of some kind of ritual. A large circle had been drawn on the floor in what was later confirmed to be ordinary table salt. Candles had been arranged around it, burned down completely. Symbols were scratched into the hardwood floors, strange markings that didn't correspond to any known language or occult practice that investigators could identify. Furniture was overturned, but in a way that seemed deliberate rather than the result of a struggle. Books lay open to specific pages, all dealing with contacting spirits or communicating with the dead. Marcus's phone was on the kitchen counter, dead battery. His wallet was there too, with cash and credit cards intact. His car sat in the driveway. His winter coat hung by the door. In the Pennsylvania December cold, he couldn't have gone far without it. But Marcus himself was nowhere to be found. Not in the house, not in the overgrown yard, not in the old carriage house out back. He had simply vanished. The investigation that followed was extensive but frustrating. Detective James Holland led the case, and he approached it with professional skepticism about the supernatural angle while taking Marcus's disappearance very seriously. People don't just vanish into thin air, he told reporters. There's always an explanation, always evidence. We just need to find it. They searched the house from top to bottom. Forensic teams examined every inch of the property. Cadaver dogs were brought in but found nothing. They pulled up floorboards and checked the walls, looking for hidden spaces where someone might have concealed a body. The property's old well was drained and searched. Nothing. No blood, no signs of violence, no indication of what had happened to Marcus Webb. Digital forensics revealed Marcus's computer search history from the days before his disappearance. He'd been researching spirit communication, seances, and something called automatic writing, where people claim to let spirits guide their hand to write messages. He'd watched numerous videos about paranormal investigation. He'd joined online forums where people discussed their experiences with haunted houses. His last internet search, conducted at 2:14 a.m. on December 4th, was chilling. What happens if you actually make contact? Detective Holland interviewed everyone who'd had contact with Marcus in the weeks before his disappearance. Friends described his deteriorating mental state, his obsession with the house's history, his increasing paranoia. But they also insisted that Marcus had never been suicidal, never expressed any desire to harm himself or run away. He was scared, Derek Patterson told police, but he was also determined. He really believed he was on the verge of discovering something important. The investigation into the house's history confirmed what Marcus had found. The Hartley family had indeed lived there, and the tragic deaths had occurred as the records showed. Edmund Hartley and his surviving son, Benjamin, had disappeared in 1899. A missing persons investigation at the time had concluded they'd likely left town to start over somewhere else, escaping the memories of their losses. But their fate had never been definitively determined. Interestingly, Marcus wasn't the first person to report strange experiences at 1428 Ashwood Lane. Detective Holland discovered that over the years, several previous residents had complained about unusual occurrences. Nothing as extreme as what Marcus reported, but enough to establish a pattern. Unexplained noises, cold spots, feelings of being watched. Most people had simply moved out. The real estate agent who'd sold Marcus the house admitted, when pressed, that it had a reputation in town. That's why it had been priced so low. Was the house actually haunted? Detective Holland didn't think so, and he had a theory. Marcus was under significant psychological stress, he explained in a case review. Divorce, isolation, financial pressure from the renovation. He became fixated on the house's tragic history and started interpreting normal old house phenomena through a paranormal lens. This created a feedback loop. The more he believed the house was haunted, the more evidence he found to support that belief. He may have experienced a psychological break and wandered off in a confused state. Search teams combed the surrounding woods and fields. They checked homeless shelters, hospitals, and morgues in surrounding counties. They investigated the possibility that Marcus had deliberately disappeared to start a new life, though his abandoned wallet and car made that unlikely. They even considered foul play, though there was no evidence of another person being involved. Months passed with no new leads. Marcus Webb had simply ceased to exist. But here's where the case takes another strange turn. In March of 2020, a hiker discovered human remains in a wooded area about 5 miles from Marcus's house. Dental records confirmed it was Marcus Webb. He'd been dead since early December, the time frame consistent with his disappearance. The cause of death was listed as exposure and hypothermia. He'd apparently walked into the woods in the middle of the night without a coat and succumbed to the cold. But this raised new questions. Why would Marcus leave his house in the middle of winter, in the middle of the night, without proper clothing? The woods where he was found weren't in a straight line from his house. They were in a direction that didn't lead to any logical destination. And perhaps most disturbing, some of the same symbols that had been scratched into his living room floor were found carved into a tree near where his body was discovered. Had Marcus carved them before he died? or had someone or something else. The official conclusion was that Marcus had experienced a mental health crisis, possibly a psychotic break, that led him to leave his house in a confused state. The ritual setup in his living room was seen as evidence of his deteriorating mental condition. The symbols were dismissed as meaningless marks created during his paranoid episode. His death was ruled accidental, the tragic result of untreated psychological issues. But those closest to Marcus struggled to accept this explanation. Marcus was scared, but he wasn't irrational, his sister Amy insisted. Something happened in that house. Something that drove him out into those woods. I don't know if it was supernatural, or if someone was gaslighting him, or if there's some other explanation we haven't thought of. But I know my brother. He wouldn't have just walked into the woods to die. The house at 1428 Ashwood Lane still stands. After Marcus's death, his estate sold it at auction. The new owners lasted 6 months before putting it back on the market, citing personal reasons for the quick sale. It's been through 3 owners since then. No one stays long. The locals whisper about it, share stories, warn people away. Whether it's actually haunted or just carries the weight of its tragic history, the house has a reputation that won't fade. Detective Holland, now retired, still thinks about the case sometimes. "I've worked hundreds of cases in my career," he said in a recent interview. "I can usually find the thread that makes everything make sense. But this one? I'm still not entirely sure what happened to Marcus Webb. The evidence points to a psychological break and a tragic accident. But there are details that don't quite fit. Those symbols, the timing, the way everything was arranged in that house. Sometimes late at night I wonder if maybe, just maybe, Marcus actually did make contact with something. And maybe he didn't like what he found. The case remains officially closed. But the mystery of what really happened on that December night, what drove Marcus Webb out of his house and into the woods where he would die, that mystery remains open. Because sometimes the scariest stories are the ones where we never quite learn the truth. And sometimes the most terrifying question isn't whether ghosts are real. It's what happens if they are, and what happens when someone truly makes contact.